Right, guys, next one being the Elizabethan policies for the poor. As usual, when you're making these notes, think about the big questions that could come up. Reasons for poverty is a big one, so try and at least make sure you have three locked in, three very solid reasons for why poverty increased. I think three ways Elizabeth dealt with poverty, okay? So think about those two problems: how you dealt with poverty, or how Elizabeth dealt with poverty, and causes of poverty, right? When I say Elizabeth, I could mean the government. Okay. Right. So huge rise in population is going to be important. There's more people to feed. Prices rise. We looked at that recently in class. Population's growing 35%. Towns and cities are growing exponentially fast. Right. With that leads to a lack of food options. Again, this is a graphic just to show reasons for poverty, which we'll go through. A lot of people feared these wandering poor. They feared who they didn't know who they were. They didn't know why they were coming. That's just a graphic of the ranking system of the social hierarchy. Um, Everyone kind of has a place here. Vagabonds are outside it, so they have no place in this social hierarchy. Sometimes outside the law, so sometimes they are linked to criminality. So you get the urban poor. So rural depopulation meant the problem of vagabondage was worse. That means more people are coming to the cities, but city life was quite hard, especially because of the difficulties with Spain, trade embargoes, the lack of the cloth trade. Again, that leads to a bit of mass unemployment. So think about those factors. Now we can connect topics. Many people who left their villages, they became beggars, turned to crime. The poor built shacks, tightly packed together. Crime and disorder grew. The urban poor grew quite fast. But there was a kind of belief that people who were able to work but didn't were simply idle. And we'll have a look at those undeserving poor or impotent poor. So the rising prices, so they're rising when the harvest goes bad. Merchants are selling food at a higher price because there's more demand. Food production grows slower than the population, so you need more food, but the food production output isn't increasing to match it. So this is going to be a problem. Less food to meet the needs of the people. Bread was the basis for diet, and grain prices rose fastest of all. Wages did not rise as fast as the prices, so people, with more people wanting work, labour was cheaper because loads of people want the job, so you can offer a lower wage. And this was a problem because, with the prices of food rising, you can only really spend your money on food just to survive. As the population grew, so did demand for land. Landowners could then charge higher rents for tenant farmers to farm crops, etc. So tenants couldn't even afford to keep their land, and some were shipped off. So to allow for sheep farming, that's going to be important. So sheep farming. So 81.6% of England's exports were English wool and woolen cloth. The price of wool would increase as demand for woolen cloth grew. So farming sheep was profitable, make more money, and more landowners started doing it. Only large farms could afford this kind of large scale business, but the problem was this sheep farming took up land that was used for growing crops or as common land, right? Common land is where poor people could kind of grow their own little patch or have their animals graze on it. So they can't use that anymore. And plus, farming sheep didn't require a lot of labour. So unemployment rises because you don't need workers to help to look after the sheep. You only need like one. Feeding sheep over winter meant some crops were specifically made for the animals to eat, which starving people were angry about it. Then you got the enclosures. So you look at the graphic on the left, you've got the open fields, common land for grazing animals, whereas the enclosures start closing off the land for people to kind of do their own thing on it, which meant less options for the poor. Again, you can pause and have a look at these little graphics just showing you in a little bit more detail what it was like. So enclosures, it meant replacing large open fields that were farmed by villagers with individual fields belonging to one person. It quite often led to smaller farms merging and tenant farmers just being kicked out. This led to, again, more unemployment, and a lot of people were angry at it. And again, you've got pastoral farming, which is the animals, arable farming, which is crops. So why did they close the land up? Well, farming techniques were improving and new ideas were spreading with the printing press. Some farmers were controlling the breeding of animals to produce better stock. It stopped livestock trampling over crops as well. Rising food prices meant an increase in arable farming too. So new techniques like improving drainage, better use of fertilizer, enclosed fields were easier to plant and drain. Some farmers practiced both arable and animal farming, so up and down husbandry. Land was used for crops one year and livestock the next. The livestock fertilized the field so that when crops were planted the next year, the soil produced more. So animals had to be in enclosed fields, so the manure was where it was needed. So that's why it's all closed off. But why does it lead to poverty? Well, these landowners grow rich. Ordinary farm labourers, or those who couldn't really afford to increase rents, they suffered. So as the money that could be earned from farming increased, landowners put up rents. More efficient crop growing techniques led to kind of less labourers being needed, and sheep farming, this required less labour than arable farming, as sheep didn't need much looking after, as we looked before, and wages were reduced. As the population rose, the supply of labour increased as well. Sometimes the common land was enclosed, so people who used to be free to graze their pigs and collect firewood there, which used to be vital for survival. So that's the real problems. Here you've got the vagabondage. So just to recap that, you've got population increase, rising prices, enclosure, unemployment leads to vagabondage. Again, you can pause and read through these, but they summarize basically anything you'll need on that question. Okay, that is quite a good graphic for that potential question. So general attitudes. So people's attitudes to the poor were based on fear and distrust. A lot of poor people tried to support themselves by begging. Homeless beggars traveled the country relying on people's charity. People hated these cranks who pretended to be sick or disabled. So cranks might eat soap to foam at the mouth or walk on crutches when they didn't need them. You've got the deserving poor. So these were people divided into two groups, the deserving and undeserving. Deserving poor, they were unable to support themselves. They included people who generally had an illness or disability which prevented them from working. It also included widows who were left with a lot of children to care for, old people and orphans. People were expected to help and support the deserving poor. Then you have the undeserving poor. So the undeserving poor or sturdy beggars were people who were considered fit to work but apparently chose not to. They often roamed the countryside looking for work. It was thought that this type of poor person was a nuisance, a burden, deserved to be punished. But by the mid 1500s, there were more people in the country than there were jobs. So the government, right? So the government, they're going to take different approaches to the two types of poor. Harsh punishments for vagrancy. These are the vagabonds, the wanderers. If caught, vagrants were put in the stocks. This is where you actually, to be fair, it was more like you'd be shackled at the legs, but you would be whipped or branded. Then they were sent back to their own parish. Parish is basically the place where they were born. Those who were caught repeatedly would be imprisoned or even hanged. So there was poor relief. So this was a local issue. You've got the poor rate, which was collected by justices of the peace, but poor relief was a local issue dealt with in different ways in different places. So Elizabeth's government adopted a more national approach. So new laws were passed out of fear of this vagrancy, change in how the poor was seen, unemployment recognised as a problem that needed to be tackled. And then you get the 1572 Vagabonds Act. So make sure you know these three statutes. So you get 1563. Don't worry too much about the date on these ones. But 1563 Statute of Artificers. basically to ensure that poor relief was collected, kind of like a benefit system. And the features: anyone who refused to pay the poor rates could be imprisoned, and officials failing to organise it could be fined. So it was a really big push on ensuring poor people kind of had that support. The Vagabond Act. So this was to stop vagrancy. So any vagrant were to be whipped and a hole drilled through each ear. Vagrants were then imprisoned if arrested for a second time, and death penalty for the third time. It also established the national poor rate for the first time. This sheltered the impotent poor. So again, a benefit system to help them out. Justices of the peace were to keep a register of the poor. Towns and cities were responsible to kind of find work for these able-bodied poor. So that was their role to kind of, right, okay, we need to get these guys into the system. And then you got the Poor Relief Act. So this was to distinguish between able-bodied and impotent poor, basically people who could work and people who couldn't, and to help the able-bodied poor find work. So justices of the peace, they were to provide these able-bodied poor with wool and raw materials to enable them to work by making things to sell. Those who refused work with where they were given help to be sent to a special prison funded by poor rates, known as the House of Correction. So this is really, those three things are three of the most important things you can focus on if you get a question where you need to show government action. And again, that's just a graphic that highlights it and gives a bit more detail, so you can pause it and take notes on that at any time. So that goes through the poor rates, vagabondage. All right, so again, make sure you're on top of it. It's always one people don't like, but yeah, don't neglect it.